Hello, everybody. It's Ed Rosenberg. I'm now with Chris McCabe, and I finally got it right. For the longest time, I was Chris McCabe, or different ways. How you doing, Chris?
Pretty good. How you doing?
I'm good. Okay, first of all,
Happy to
Chris,
be here.
thank you very much. I know you actually, when we started this group and when we were discussing making a dinner. You're the first person who everyone said we have to have at our dinner, and before it was anything, you agreed right away. You said you'd
Great.
love to be there. So I want to thank you very much. You had a big part in making this group happen. Thank you.
Happy to be here. Thanks.
Right. Now, to those that don't know, Chris is one of the leaders in getting people back from suspensions and from blacklistings and general Amazon compliance. He writes a blog which is seen by thousands of people. He's
Right.
very famous.
Account
And
uh, account suspension avoidance becoming a much bigger piece of what I do too. Yeah.
account suspension avoidance. And
Yep.
how does that work? You like log into our accounts or?
Yeah, I conduct account reviews. It's kind of the first level of service I do for people. Initially, when I haven't had any prior contact with them or don't know anything about their account, it's how I learn about their account.
Right.
Um, it gives me an idea of the trouble spots and the weaknesses they have, which sometimes people aren't 100% honest with themselves about where they need to improve.
Right.
And since I kind of pick that apart, in a productive, constructive way for them and write it up for them, it gets them at least heading in the right direction, which is away from things like account reviews or any kind of manual investigation based on their, policy violations, however many they might have, whether it's one, two, or seven or 10. Kind of depends on the seller, but
Right, so it does help. Now, what doesn't reviews like those type of reviews do? Like, I mean, if they suspect you're selling real counterfeit, that's not going to help you, correct?
well, if I can identify that there's some bad product based on the buyer complaints and they are able to figure out that they trusted the wrong supplier or just for whatever reason sourced a unlucky item, an item that attracts trouble for whatever reason, if we can catch that first before Amazon does for whatever reason, maybe buyer complaints didn't necessarily result in the wrong kind of wording or the nature of the wording of the buyer complaint didn't result in a particularly awful policy violation email from product quality. If we can catch that and get them away from that, they're less likely to have trouble, obviously in the future from problem orders that are item quality based, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense, and I've
It's like,
seen. I
it's
mean,
like, yeah, go
the
ahead.
high, to me, it seems like the higher the perfect order score is, the further away you are from suspension. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, well, generally speaking, yeah. I mean, I tend to find a lot of weak spots for sellers in that gets away from the numbers. It's more anecdotal, and I think sometimes people focus a little bit too much on their the ODR attached to a particular ASIN, which is very important, but also not paying enough attention to the wording of buyer messages to them, the wording of feedback claims. I mean, a lot of those turn into buyer reports to Amazon of counterfeit, which it might just be a damaged item. I mean, we've talked in the past, of course, about how inauthentic warnings can really just be about materially different items, right? So
Right.
um, so sometimes it's in the minutia, and they are one-offs. If you have enough one-offs, then they're not one-offs anymore.
Hmm.
And those can lead to, of course, warnings, and then enough of those you're going to get reviewed to see if you should be suspended. So,
Right. So you could be at 98% perfect order,
oh
and
yeah, your numbers can be fantastic. I mean, they're actually assuming almost, if you want to use the word assumption, the assumption is that your metrics are going to be great no matter what. Because if your policy problems are mounting and you have bad metrics, then you're not going to be selling actively on the site anyway.
hmm
So they're already at the point where they assume your metrics are going to be hitting all the targets. But beyond that, they need to know that you're taking care of these item quality issues that people complain about.
right. So
So
basically, you're never safe.
pretty much, I mean, that's what a lot of the account reviews I do are for people who think that they've got everything covered. And then I start, of course, I'm looking for problems because I operate under the assumption that you're never safe and that one little thing can blow up into something bigger, which sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. You can't always predict the future, but it's better safe than sorry, right?
Yeah. Now I
Um,
know I know you said I know I think March or April time, like when they started looking at the product quality issues, a lot of people got suspended. Has it increased or decreased or stayed the same? The
you
amount
mean
of
from last year, last summer?
yeah.
Yeah. Well, there were definitely spikes last summer for sure. And about a year ago is when I noticed it trending upward. I'm not sure if spring was worse than summer. Um, But a lot of the problem, of course, isn't just how many people are getting suspended, it's the quality of the responses you get when you send in a plan, right? Because you could send in three wonderful plans. They might send you the same blurb over and over and over, asking you for more information just to kind of get rid of you, right? To placate your need for a response, but it doesn't help you get reinstated any quicker.
Hmm.
Uh, and that's where everyone has to start escalating, right? If you're basically being ignored and you spend a lot of time and effort doing it the right way, putting a good plan of action together, but they're not reading it, or they're too backlogged, or you sent it at the wrong time of day when they were, thin coverage and they didn't have the best people on it, you're kind of stuck. So you have
Okay.
to escalate. And if everyone's escalating at the same time, that means the escalation responses are slower too.
Wow.
So, I
Okay, I
know.
want to get you a couple of specifics in which I wrote down here, which is I believe pressing right now. UK lockouts. I've had people that have been saying that they just wake up and all of a sudden they can't even log into their account. What exactly is happening and how do you avoid that?
Hard to avoid it. Basically, what's going on, at least in the UK, from what I've heard from account manager contacts I had, was the verifications process. It's KYC, know your customer type stuff, where they're prompting you to submit certain kinds of documents, certain kinds of information. And if it's not complete, if there's anything missing, sometimes it's just typos that people submit information that is considered incomplete for whatever reason. Then they are signing you out of your UK account, and until they get everything they need, they're leaving you basically in this status, which could be anything from more info needed from you to, we don't want this guy to sell because he's not giving us any information we can use.
Hmm.
And so if people have changed business names, changed addresses, if there's any inconsistency in the information, they seem to err on the side, just like they err on the side of suspending you versus not in the suspension cases we've talked about. Other places, they err on the side of signing you out of your account until you get them everything they need to see.
Now, why is it only in the UK? Like in the US, I don't remember anyone asking me for a passport and all kinds of
Yeah,
doc.
it's just more stringent. Know your customer.
Hmm.
It's a bit different over there, kind of for security reasons. Amazon's trying to avoid liability, bad press, and risk in general. And if they think that you're giving them less information, they've already decided what information they want from you. If they decide that it's not enough or it's inconsistent, or just like if Amazon asks you for invoices and you give them invoices that don't encourage them to get you back on the site or to reinstate your ASIN, they'd rather just sort of say, well, until we get what we need, you're going to be stuck in this limbo, or you're just not going to be active to sell.
Wow.
And the problem becomes, what do you do about it if you have no visibility into the process? And I barely have any visibility into it myself. I just researched it. You have a queue that you write into, the evaluation queue. You can write to the people doing verifications, but there could be a huge backlog. You're never going to know where you are in that pipeline. Some people get responses within a reasonable amount of time. Some people never get responses. It varies quite a bit. And I haven't actually met and talked to somebody who's processing verifications yet. So until that point, I'm basically just asking account managers what they think, and sometimes asking people if they can give me status on a particular seller. So,
Right. So even someone like you, you have, you can try your best to organize the documents, but
right. I mean, I used to work the UK queues. Those were the English language queues, email queues that I worked at when I was at Amazon. So this is something that came in afterwards. Maybe what, a year ago or a year and a half ago, I started hearing about these.
mhm.
But a lot of people have sort of given up. Some people kept at it and got back on. I haven't studied enough user cases to know the differences between them. I mean, I think somebody's information or documents are stronger than somebody else's. And if they look at your selling history and you're larger, that always helps a little bit. But they need to be able to verify you. And if
Hmm.
they don't consider you verified, then they can't let you sell.
Right, but sometimes it seems to happen like 2 years into the process.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's kind of like a retroactive type, program. I mean, why they put it into place, who knows? It's more important to know that it's there, and that if you have a UK account, specifically UK is what I've handled mostly in my experience. You need to make sure, just like you would for a US account, that you have all your documentation straight, you've got all your business information clear and easy to understand, because people looking at these processing verifications might not spend a ton of time looking at your info if it's not readily accessible to them.
Hmm.
Just like if you were suspended in the US and you sent a POA and you sent, information was all over the place and they had to hunt high and low to find what they needed, they probably wouldn't bother. They would just say, nope, no thanks, come back when you're ready, and that would be the end of it.
Wow. Something. Okay.
Uh,
Next
or-
hot topic:
yeah,
product reviews. So I know firsthand that there are people. I know one person who got a warning
yeah.
for 2 minute reviews, and I know people who got suspended. What's going on?
I guess first off, if you get the warning, pay attention to it because it means they consider you to be somebody who's using buyer account or accounts to inflate reviews on one of your top sellers, which is, I mean, this all basically began because VPs started basically getting complaints or paying more attention to people that they consider were abusing the system, manipulating the system to increase their sales, right?
Right.
Same as we've seen in other things. Product quality teams came into being because of certain kinds of complaints that escalated to VPs, and the VPs decided it couldn't be tolerated. In those cases, it was item quality complaints. In this case, it's abuse of the review system more or less undermines the buyer's faith in the marketplace and the buyer's ability to trust review type information on the site. So you can imagine what's their main concern is that people will start ignoring reviews or not trusting them, and then that's what they're trying to prevent right now. So if you get a warning, pay attention to it. It means they think you're conducting some form of abuse around reviews. You're not going to get a lot of additional warnings. You might only get one. If they think your behavior is egregious enough, you've got multiple buyer accounts doing it. I've heard all kinds of stories, but generally the theme seems to be they'll take out your buyer accounts and your seller account down with it. Those reinstatements can be a lot harder than the normal ones that we've talked about before.
Wow. So in other words, if you're giving your brother-in-law a review, beware.
Certainly be careful. I mean, they're tracking this in a couple different ways from what I've been told from people who were, maybe not working on those teams, but working there while those teams were being set up, which wasn't that long ago, actually. This
Mm.
is still kind of a work in progress. So we don't know 100% what they're going to do in every case just because we don't have that many user cases or much experience to go by.
Right.
Um, if you have an ASIN that's all of a sudden getting all these glowing reviews overnight, that's going to be flagged and that's going to attract attention. Just the normal ways that you would expect an algorithm to pick up something, and you don't want to attract that kind of attention by certainly overdoing it. We could talk about, well, if you stagger it over weeks or months, is it different? Yeah, of course, it's less visible if it's happening over more, period of time. But the bottom line is their tools can track relations between accounts, as we all know. And if they see buyer accounts associated with your seller account, some of your top sellers are getting all these glowing reviews from those buyer accounts, you're going to have a major problem very quickly. Uh,
Right. Right. Now,
yep.
you're talking about, I believe, like, you're either creating buyer accounts to give reviews, but how about like using a software where you give like 90% off and you get 100 people going to the item and they're all giving honest reviews. Obviously, those not
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what's shaking out now, right? Amazon's still deciding what they think about all this stuff, but what's an honest review and what isn't? I mean, if you're financially inducing somebody to leave reviews, whether you were doing it in the past and getting away with it, and will you in the future? I mean, no, in the future they're going to be closing that off.
Mhm.
So anyone who's trying to pile into that space now to get a few last ones in, I mean, yeah, they're still sorting through some of this stuff. You might get away with more now than you do next month, but you certainly can't get away with now what you could have gotten away with a year ago because they're paying tons more attention to this space now.
Right.
Uh,
It seems like even, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I mean, you can roll the dice. It's just like any other risk with your account. You can roll the dice on some of this stuff if you really want to try to get a couple of extra good reviews on your top selling ASIN. But I mean, eventually, if you get kind of hooked on doing that, you could take it too far, and you have to consider the risk of, well, you might not get that many chances to come back if they think you took it too far, and if they think you're a bad, character who's manipulating the system. I mean, people get shut down for abuse a lot more now with their buyer accounts.
Hmm.
And I know I've had some clients in the past who were doing some interesting things with their buyer accounts, and they thought, well, Amazon's never going to, close down a buyer account unless I'm doing outright fraud. That's not the case anymore. Um, if there's abuse around, things like gift certificates or, refunds abuse, I've had people who had their seller accounts closed because they're buying and returning too many items. I'm sorry, returns, not refunds. Well, people have been closed for leaving bad feedback for competitors, right? If they kept doing it, any chronic abuse of any system that they've got going, even if there are people who are closed for excessively contacting Amazon as a seller or a buyer. If you spam Amazon, then you could see your buyer and seller account totally disappear. So if you start doing spam type, positive product reviews, just because you see everybody else getting away with it, in your category, you might be the one who's singled out to go down for it to be made an example of. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. See, personally, I wish they wouldn't have any of these, but because so many people are doing it, like a lot of people are feeling that they got to run just to stay in place, and that if you have, especially private label, it's like a perfect thing. You have a
Yeah.
private label item, you post it, you send in 100 reviews, and the sales ranking will go up, right? And the reviews are great, and you're in business.
It comes down to any other internal team. I mean, my areas of expertise are mostly transaction risk management services, which was, performance and policy, which is where I used to work. But it's like anything else. Like, what are the internal resources they have to police stuff? Do they want to police stuff? Do they care? Does it take a VP to care for that group to care? How much time do they want to spend on training? If they think the product review space is out of control, which I think we can all pretty much agree is the case, they're not going to split hairs when it comes time to, we've seen with product quality, right? With enforcement actions, they're happy to throw blankets over entire groups of people just to sort out later who's right and who's wrong, or who's creating a problem and who isn't.
Wow.
Uh, for them, the scalability is to be overly aggressive at the outset and then roll back who gets on and who doesn't come back on later after the fact. Meanwhile, you're off the site, you're losing sales,
Phew. And you
right?
never know when you're getting back.
But that's why you have to think the way Amazon thinks, right? Because the way they think is what's the easiest way for us to scale this, but also be effective to the goal that we've set up for ourselves. A distant third is, how is this going to affect some sellers who don't really need to be investigated or shut down for this reason? And their tools, might not be perfect. Their SOPs might not be perfect.
Right.
It's not just the intent behind their actions, it's also how it's implemented, right? Just like with creating laws in the government, right? Sometimes they pass a law and it sounds great on paper, but then when in practice they can't write it very well, and it doesn't end up accomplishing what they wanted it to. Same thing with Amazon, big
Right.
bureaucracy.
Well,
So
I wanted to ask you, health and beauty. I've gotten some people saying health and beauty that it's like a really tough space. Want to give me
yeah.
some background on that, please?
You mean in terms of like on the product quality side, what was getting people in trouble, or
Yeah, like I spoke to someone, they were like 99% perfect
yeah,
order, and then all of a sudden they're getting inauthentic
yep.
perfumes.
Just because there's a lot of inauthentic perfume just being sold in the marketplace in general. Who's selling it on any given day is sometimes murky and confusing
Hmm.
um, to policy investigators. So they can only go by the buyer complaint in front of them and what it sounds like and what it looks like. They're not going to pull everyone's FBA inventory and study it, or go to all your warehouses and look over what you've got and where you're sourcing it. I mean, the only way for them to scale that kind of work is to use the buyers as the testers,
Hmm.
basically.
Right,
Um,
because I found, because health and beauty, some of the categories you can only sell new, I believe.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a tricky space also because of things, product safety and compliance issues, which they're spending tons more. They're putting a lot more energy and effort into this. Anything that involves your health, right? I mean, health and beauty, you're applying it to your skin or you're ingesting it.
Hmm.
Health items, vitamins, right? You're ingesting it, you're swallowing it. I mean, you know how they were with the hoverboards, maybe
Yeah,
envy some people.
I was thinking about
Imagine
that.
how they are for people like who say, hey, I bought all these vitamins. They're melted, they're expired. That's why so much attention on the expired stuff in the last year. Anything that could result in liability or bad press or bad public image for, you know, Amazon via a marketplace seller, it's worth it for them to come down hard on people versus take the chance that there's a few things out there that are going to hurt,
Right.
buyers.
They
The
care about Amazon.com, basically.
Yeah, I mean, think about, social media over the even just the last 3, 4 years. I mean, this stuff can spread like wildfire, whether it's true or not. The only chance they really have is to limit the number of bad opportunities there are for them to get complaints that other buyers say, hey, yeah, I bought something like that too, and all of a sudden it mushrooms into, something that's on Gawker or one of these other
Right.
websites. and a lot of people read that stuff.
Sure.
And that's a headache Amazon doesn't really need. They'd much rather have a product quality team that, might be a bit understaffed or might have sort of a rotating manager class running it, and just let them have their way and act unilaterally to take whatever enforcement actions they think, they deem are necessary.
Right.
Whether or
Wow.
not the accuracy is where it should be or the efficacy is open to debate.
Right,
Um,
right, but they don't care. In other words, to me, it seems like they don't care about taking down having a few false positives for the good of
right.
the company.
That's my impression. And when you talk health and beauty, you're talking about, like, say, somebody who's selling testers as new, which a lot of people were doing, right? Obviously, if you got something that's not intended for resale, it's a display item, and you're selling that new, you're getting it at some kind of discount. This gets us back into the gray market,
Hmm.
retail arbitrage, closeouts, liquidations discussion that we're always returning to.
Yeah.
If you're buying something cheap and selling it high, that's great for margin, but what's the risk behind that? And if you get used to it, and then all of a sudden you have to change your business model because they say, "Hey, we've got three buyers complaining that you sold display items or test perfumes as new," you're done doing that. You can't go back to doing that at all. You have to purge all of that from your inventory immediately. And when you write your plan of action, you have to make sure that you say that you've already taken care of that. There's no chance after your inventory is scrutinized. There's no chance that somebody else is going to complain about that in the future, and actually be correct. I mean, maybe they'd complain thinking this might be a tester based on the color or the scent of the perfume. That's not something you can control. What you can control is not sourcing testers and selling them as new,
Right.
product. Just because you got away with it in the past doesn't mean you'll get away with it in the future. So,
Well, I mean, I have seen people leave feedback, like they'll buy a tie and they'll say, it didn't match my outfit or something.
yeah. Um, I mean, with health and beauty, there's been a lot of bad actors in that category. I mean, some of it's just what kind of people are attracted to certain products.
Mm.
Health and beauty, because of the margins people get, because of the places they could source them, because of the ways that they got away with some of the stuff in the past, without too much trouble, at least before product quality came along. People were attracted to selling that stuff and they were doing pretty well with it, but the nature of that category has changed in terms of policy and item quality enforcement.
Wow.
So,
Okay, that was great information, Chris. Now,
yeah.
I wanted to ask you this. Can you tell me the funniest suspension you've ever seen?
Funniest suspension. You mean like
Over the top,
coming
like for doing
coming through
nothing.
my intake form and saying I'm suspended and this is why, basically, and
Yeah.
it's a crazy reason. Um, well, I mean, the one I always think of when people ask me that is I had a seller who they didn't become a client of mine ultimately. They may have, solved it themselves, but they did apparel for parrots. They did like little jackets, I guess, that you put on birds, and maybe not just parrots, but yeah, I guess they had people complaining that their parrot didn't fit their parrot right, and it wasn't the right size, or maybe
Uh,
like the right color, something like that. But
the
I've
parrot.
seen interesting stuff. I mean, some people have complained to me that they were, like I said, they were emailing Amazon way too much, and Amazon was just like, "This isn't worth it. We're just going to close the account. We can't keep answering emails, which are, all over the map." If you're kind of, attention deficit disorder and you respond to everything, way outside of what's reasonable, then yeah, those are kind of interesting because I don't understand why somebody wouldn't stop themselves from doing something to agitate, Amazon, which
Right.
is never a good idea, right?
You just
So,
gotta treat them like nice and not antagonize them.
I mean, you sometimes if you think they made a mistake with something, you have to antagonize them a little bit, or if they're sending you the same email over and over about your suspension, then of course there's some antagonism there. But I guess what I've seen is people needlessly antagonizing them about things that were relatively minor,
Hmm.
instead of just letting an ASIN go, which may or may not have been such a great seller. I mean, to write them every day about how you need to have that ASIN back, and
Right.
and finally they finally tell you, we looked at everything, we understand, we looked at everything you gave us, we're just not going to let you do it. I mean, that's when you have to kind of split off and do something else. You can't send them 14 new emails the next day, because I think some sellers think, like, the more I apply pressure and the more I pester them, they'll eventually do what I want them to do. but they don't do anything that they don't want to do, right?
Right. I mean, have you seen? I like the POAs where people get like really emotionally involved. You know, I'm supporting my
Uh,
son-in-law, and have you seen a lot of that?
I mean, oh yeah. Well, emotion takes over anytime, it's somebody's livelihood or it's somebody's business and they've been employing people for years, or if they're the sole breadwinner for the family. Those, I mean, some of them are amusing to an extent, but also sort of sad and troubling because, well, A, troubling because they've lost their source of income and it might be hard to get back. Um, B, they don't realize that they're hurting their chances of getting their account back by writing these stories, which are A, or one, too long, B, have the wrong information. It's like a combination of they're creating kind of a storm around themselves, and you don't want to make it difficult for them to reinstate you. You want to make it as easy as possible for them to say, hey, this person knows what they did wrong. They've already fixed it. We're all speaking the same language. They sent me a POA that's easy to read, not impossible to read. All the emotion, all the commentary. I mean, I've seen people just write angry rants about Amazon, and they think that's their POA. And the
I'm gonna
question,
sue you.
well, I mean, it's almost like if you were the well-behaved prisoner in the prison, are you going to get more or less privileges? Or if you're constantly
Right.
causing problems, are the guards and the warden going to treat you better or worse?
Right.
I mean, have no illusions about who's in control of this sort of partnership or business relationship you have with Amazon. I mean, they have the final say on this stuff, and they're very careful about how they deal with you to make sure they're not breaking, policies, laws, things like that. The burden would really be on you if you're deciding that you're going to go after Amazon and accuse them of something that they can't defend in a court of law. Hopefully, you're an attorney yourself, or one who's guided you through, dealing with them on a legal basis because, they don't fail when it comes to things like that.
Yeah.
You've agreed, you've signed terms and conditions, right? You've agreed to sell under circumstances which more or less grant Amazon almost like parental kind of power over you, right? And you're
Hmm.
the child. That's sort of how it works.
It's amazing. Okay, so that was a really great interview. Thank you very much, Chris. One last question: Does Jeff Bezos has he ever responded to you? I know he has a team of people, but is there even a chance of him responding himself to anything?
Responding to seller like Bezos escalations.
Exactly. Yeah.
Not so much anymore. I mean, what he did when I guess what I know most about is, when I was working there, anytime I got an email that went through the escalation chain that had his email address, of course, which I knew, and a question mark, that meant he had actually seen it and wanted his people to look into it. So
Hmm.
those were people who had written directly to him. He had seen the email, maybe skimmed it, or he understood the issues that were prompting that person to write to him, and then he added the question mark to have them look into that one versus maybe several other that came in that day that he didn't want to look at.
Wow.
Uh, I don't know if he's doing that so much now. I mean, he's got executive seller relations people handling those escalations, and there's so many more of them now,
Hmm.
because people aren't getting the answers that they need from product quality primarily, but also seller performance and other teams. If you get a non-answer, an answer that's just intended to get you out of the email queue, but not to answer your question, you have to escalate. You have to write to Jeff these days because sometimes nobody else is really going to take the time to understand what you've written, read it.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I know when you were in Amazon, I think you had told me at Abigail's that you yourself suspended people. Is that correct?
Oh, of course. Yeah. And reinstated both. I mean, that was the lion's share of my day
So
was.
how does it work? Just a button?
The tools have changed a bit since I left. Yeah, I mean, I was basically taking a suspension action using the tool on the account, and that's what would prompt the messaging to go out saying you had 17 days to reply with a plan of action. But there's also differences. People use the word suspension to cover for anything that would involve closing your account. But I mean, there were some accounts that we didn't want to suspend them. We wanted to close them out completely and permanently, so we block. So there's a difference between the lingo. Blocking is you're closed, and sure, you can appeal just like anyone can, but our intention is to keep you off, not to suspend you while you work out the kinks and figure out your problems.
Hmm.
And then, sometimes we also just sent warnings. If it was just kind of one particular order, one ASIN, it seemed like a bad item. you might just get a warning for it.
But you never looked at the item, is that correct? You just looked at the data.
Look, you mean look physically looked at the item?
Yeah, because you know I see a lot of people, and the way I see it, Amazon is just looking at the data. You see too many complaints, too many damages. You don't
Yeah.
actually like look at the listing, look at the item, and see who's right. Is that correct?
I mean, it wasn't working like hand in hand with FBA people getting on the phone or
Right,
emailing them directly like, hey, can you pull this? I mean, it's not like that. Very little overlap, if any, there.
right. It's just data.
Yeah, there's no overlap between those teams, really. Um, it's really just looking at because the patterns were typically consistent. There weren't a lot of variations. I mean, if certain buyers complained about this kind of product with certain kinds of sellers, you would see a certain number of like reports on the account or warnings that we had sent them in the past. And sometimes people don't take significant action when they get warned, right? They only take significant actions to change their operations or maybe to stop selling something problematic when they get suspended.
Right.
So, I mean, I wasn't suspending people. Product quality wasn't something that was in existence when I was there. So, performance and policy sort of was shared on a team basis by groups of us. I wasn't just sort of doing rampant suspensions, taking groups of accounts out, which sometimes based on just item condition, relatively minor infractions these days are getting people suspended. You'd have to have lots and lots of those materially different complaints, and also bad metrics, right, in those days to take people down. Otherwise, you couldn't really justify, if somebody's selling a million or two a month, you couldn't really justify, well, they had a handful of complaints about, dings in boxes or packaging or something that was damaged arriving, in a defective state. I mean, some of that just happens in the course of shipping,
Right.
right? So even for you, if you're not a seller, if you're sending something to a friend of yours and you use USPS and you use the wrong kind of box, right? There might be something that goes wrong while it's being handled. So that can happen to anybody. The question is, they're looking for patterns of misbehavior or people using cheap packaging where they need to use better packaging, just as one example, um, or people who are being kind of a bit inattentive about their listings. Is it 100% matching what the item is, or a buyer's going to say, hey, this is different from what you listed. This isn't what was advertised.
Wow.
People got away with these things a bit more in the old days. Now with the screws kind of tightening on all sellers, you have to be paying attention to everything.
Every single rule, and you're never safe. Like,
You have to know the policies. Some people don't even really intend to follow the policies from the beginning, or they don't learn them at all. So the first step is knowing what the policies are, knowing what the rules are, and then the second step, of course, is following them.
right.
So
I actually think following like your blogs and people who have their finger to the pulse, I think is fantastic because you always know what they're looking for.
yeah, I mean, I tend to warn people. I err on the side of saying, hey, look out for this, even
Yeah.
if I mean it might not be every seller that needs to pay attention to that every day of their lives, but it's better to know something before Amazon knows it and to pick up on a problem before they do. It's not always possible. I understand that, and selling's not easy. I mean, I know enough about it now without ever having sold myself. I know about it from being on the inside for years and years, and now doing this for a couple of years. I know it's not easy, but it sort of doesn't matter how easy it is anymore. You can say humans make mistakes, and that's true, but they kind of don't care. They sort of want to make sure that the mistakes are gone and that they won't have future problems from whatever they've identified as a current problem.
Right.
That's
They don't,
really
they blame you. They don't want that mistakes could happen under your account. So like if you're shipping something and it's always getting damaged in shipping, even though you could say it's always UPS's fault, they'll blame you, the seller.
it's not even a matter of it's like we have to take time to look at this and to look at these problem orders, and you have to take time to look at it. I mean, they want the seamless experience where buyers don't have to contact you, Amazon doesn't have to
Exactly.
contact you. They'd rather not know you're there, except for purposes of like expanding your selection and making it so that you can sell more. I mean, if you're a great seller, they should be interested in reaching out to you and saying, hey, you should be doing 10 million more a year. You're only doing 5 million, you could be doing 15, something like that. Beyond
Right.
those kinds of conversations for like business development, they don't want to hear about problems. For Amazon, the only way to eliminate problems is to have you kind of fix them out of the gate so that buyers aren't out there complaining about your orders, because Amazon buyers are always going to complain more than anyone else in the e-commerce world.
Right, but if your Amazon buyers are complaining more than other Amazon buyers, they'll get you.
Right. I mean, there's a certain number of random stray
Yeah,
messages that any seller can get from one buyer on one order. That's a one-off, right? I mean, if it's just one person out there who can't be satisfied no matter what, I mean, Amazon knows that those buyers exist, right? It's
sure.
more like what are the pattern of complaints, you know?
Right.
Getting consistent complaints that your listings aren't matching what's being sent. I mean, some people just have chronic problems, they're fulfilled by merchant. They're just, having picking and packing errors and they keep sending the wrong item, right? Or the wrong size. Just things that could be sort of fixed on an operational level that for whatever reason aren't being fixed. That could be most of your complaints. But unfortunately, even though that's a normal, kind of warehouse mistake kind of problem. I mean, that can get
Yeah.
you suspended if it happens enough times.
Right.
Even if you're not selling crazy, buying from crazy suppliers and selling items that you can't show good invoices for, even if it seems like it's less of a problem because it's just a picking and packing error. I mean, still, that's a problem order.
Maybe you could probably reinstate that pretty quickly.
Well, I mean, yeah, but what if you get reinstated, but you haven't really, you
Hmm.
promised to make certain changes, you don't do the changes that you promised in the POA, and you're back in the same boat, suspended a couple months later for the same reasons. It's not good to get suspended more than, multiple times for the same reason.
Really? Yeah.
It makes it look like you don't know how to fix the problems even when you know what they are, which looks pretty bad. And it also makes it look to Amazon like they're going to have to keep reliving this with you over and over, like some kind of movie, right? Where it's just like, it's like the people who have memory problems and keep living the same day over and over. I mean, Amazon doesn't want that. They
Right.
would rather see whatever business you're supplying filled by someone else in your category who can do it better than you can and call it a day. They don't get emotional about it. To them, it's just cold hard business decisions based on past experience. If past experience shows that you had some one-offs, you fixed them, and then you're smooth sailing for 12 more months before something else happens, great. Maybe you have something new you have to tweak. That's normal.
Hmm.
But if you're going to be a consistent, like behind the curve on fixing things, and Amazon has to keep kind of picking you apart, at that point, it's not worth it to them, even if you're doing great revenue, because they're taking commissions from your sales, but they're still tasking people to look at your account. They consider you more of a risk. Of course, bad buyer experience, right? The underlying foundation for everything they do. Um, at some point, they cut bait and they're not interested in having the same discussion or constantly sort of plugging holes that you're creating on your account. So,
Wow. And do you have a little more? This is my last question. I have so many
yeah, yeah,
questions, and thank you so much for your patience.
no problem.
It's like a treat to talk to you.
Anything
Thank
for
you.
you, Ed.
Private label. Do you have a little more leeway?
Leeway in terms of
Because like if I'm selling something without 20 other sellers, they really don't need me. But if I'm selling a private label item, or does that not play into decision making?
I mean, a lot of people think that and are heading into private label for that reason. The question really becomes, is the investigator looking at your account thinking, oh, they're private label versus, hey, they're not private label? How many times are people, that's almost a question I have to ask you or anyone else. How many times are investigators thinking that when they're doing investigations? None of them that I've talked to have told me that's the
Hmm.
first thing they look at or think about. Um, in terms of, is there less risk if you're not piggybacking on somebody else's ASIN when the ASIN contributions are changing all the time? Well, yeah, I mean, of course, right? That just makes sense. But there are all sorts of other pitfalls that private label involves, right? Um, Due diligence that you have to do as a private label seller. And when it comes down to it, if people are reporting you for things or complaining about things, it doesn't matter really what you're selling. If you're a problem, you're a problem.
Wow.
And if Amazon thinks you're a problem, then you're definitely a problem. Whether or not you'd like to debate whether you're actually a problem, it sort of doesn't
Right.
matter at that point.
You have a problem if they think you're a
Well, I
problem.
mean, it's not about defending. A lot of people think it's about defending themselves. If I don't convince Amazon that I've never sold anything counterfeit, then I'm screwed. Well, it's not so much about convincing them, creating a persuasive argument about how everything they just wrote you about was completely way off base and they made tons of mistakes in their investigation on you. It's even if that's true, it's not really worth your time
Wow.
um, to pick apart all their arguments. A lot of people, it's tempting to do it if you're accused of something that you're 100% sure you're not doing. But by the same time, I know what the result is on their end, which is just, oh, this guy's in denial. This guy doesn't think anything's going wrong. Come back to us when you're ready to admit to all the things that we think you're doing, and we'll talk then, and we'll look at your plan at that
Wow.
point. So Yeah.
That was
Little,
great.
yeah.
Anything in closing, Chris? That was just an awesome
No,
conversation.
nothing. Let's do this again sometime.
Yeah, that was
Same time
great.
tomorrow.
Yeah, yeah. Don't you know? I may just take you on to it. No, but that was a really good conversation. And again, thanks a lot for joining us at Abigail that time. It meant a lot to me and everyone else. Thank you so much.
Looking forward to the next one.
Yes, so am I. Thank you.